Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. The Gulf International Forum once again has the pleasure of welcoming what has become a worldwide audience to a timely and very important discussion on the Islamabad deal, the regional consequences of US Iran breakthrough. Only a few weeks ago, the prospect of a direct US Iran understanding seemed remote. That probably is the biggest understatement of this program right now. Yet today we find ourselves discussing what some are already calling the Islamabad deal, a memorandum of understanding that has halted a dangerous escalation, reopened critical channels of trade and communication, and created a 60-day window for negotiations on the most consequential security issues that have confronted the Middle East in a generation. At first glance, the agreement appears straightforward: a pause in conflict, a reopening of maritime commerce, and a framework for further talks. But beneath the headlines, we can find much larger questions. How does Tehran view this agreement? As a strategic necessity, as a diplomatic success, or as an uncomfortable compromise? How do the Gulf states interpret it? As a welcome de escalation, the beginning of a new regional order, or simply a temporary pause in a rivalry that remains fundamentally unresolved? Stakes extend far beyond Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran. The future of Gulf security, the stability of energy markets, freedom of navigation, missile programs, proxy networks, sanctions, and the broader balance of power across the Middle East are all implicated in what happens next. Perhaps most importantly, we must ask whether this agreement addresses the causes of conflict or merely its symptoms. Is this a first step towards a durable regional settlement, or simply another intermission in a long running strategic competition? And I might add that having read the Washington Post headlines this morning, are we actually going to have the implementation of this agreement? To help explore these questions, we are fortunate to have three distinguished experts with us today. Together, they will examine the agreement from Iranian, Gulf, and international perspectives and help us understand not only what has been achieved, but what remains uncertain as or if the next phase of negotiations begin. Allow me to introduce our panelists. Mehran Kamrava is a professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. His research focuses on the modern political history and contemporary issues of the Middle East. Professor Kamrava is the author of numerous journals, articles, and books, including most recently, How Islam Rules in Iran, Theology and Theocracy in the Islamic Republic. Anna Jacobs is a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and the former senior Gulf analyst at International Crisis Group in Washington, having just returned, I understand, from Doha. Ross Harrison, senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and author of the book Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy. He is also a faculty member of the Political Science Department at the University of Pittsburgh, where he teaches courses on Middle East politics and U.S. foreign policy in the region. So let's begin with a round of questions. Mehran, how should we assess the agreement from Tehran's perspective? To what extent does the MOU advance Iran's strategic, economic, and security objectives? And where might Iranian leaders believe that they have made significant compromises?
Uh, First, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure sharing the screen with such distinguished fellow panelists. Um, I think from Tehran's perspective, uh, this is a strategic victory. The fact that they've been able to not only withstand attacks by two nuclear powers, but to bring the United States to the negotiating table. And for better or for worse, the Iranians have wanted the process of negotiations. They've gotten the process that they wanted. They did not necessarily want to jump into negotiations. They wanted a framework for negotiations. This is something that they'd been calling for in the past. believing that the issues at stake were far too complex to be able to deal with in a summary fashion. And they got this. Now, whether or not this is the right strategic move on their part is a different story. But certainly, Tehran feels that the fact that they were able to get this MOU and that they got the text of the MOU that reflects many of their priorities is a major victory for them. Now, the devil is in the details, and of course, we have to wait and see whether or not a final agreement will be reached, and if it will be reached, whether it will be binding on the Americans. There's absolutely no reason, going all the way back to 2015, to think that the Americans would abide by the terms of any agreement that they will strike with Iran. And I don't see that this time would be any different, but we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you, Mehran. Uh, Question, just a quick question on the Iranian negotiations. Do you think that they are looking at a final grand deal at the end, or sort of a series of deals pouring out a little bit at a time?
That's a really good question, but I'm not sure if the Iranians themselves know the answer to that. And it's way too early. We have to wait and see to what extent the Iranians are willing to engage with the Americans. One thing to keep in mind is that everybody in the world appears to know how to deal with Trump's idiosyncrasies and his personality, which defies rational description at times. The Iranians, on the other hand, have not figured that out. And they have no idea how to deal with Trump's transactionalism. And so, whether or not they would have learned a lesson, a valuable lesson, to figure out how to deal with Trump's idiosyncrasies, how to really capitalize on what is indeed a historic opportunity, whereby Trump is not ideological, doesn't seem to have this ideological grand vision of America's role in the world or America's relationship with Israel. And so, whether or not they have learned that lesson, I think remains to be seen in the weeks coming.
Thank you, Ron. Anna, how are the Gulf states likely to interpret this agreement? Do the GCC capitals see the MOU primarily as a de-escalation mechanism, or or as a way forward?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me as well. This is obviously a very timely discussion. The way I would describe a lot of what I'm hearing about this agreement is positive but concerned, if that's clear. Of course, positive in the sense of this alternative is, of course, better than anything else. So this MOU is a temporary framework to basically continue on a path of de-escalation. Yes. So in that sense, I think across the GCC, they are viewing this in a relatively positive way. I would say there is, of course, quite a bit of concern as well, because even as sort of a temporary framework, the MOU doesn't address, I think, a lot of their core concerns about Iran. So those would be the missiles, drones, Iran's relationship with non-state actors in the region. All of these were used to attack them a lot over the last several months. So the fact that I think none of those are even mentioned is concerning. Obviously, this is an MOU. It is not a final settlement, and they all are very aware of that. But I still think that even the fact that they're not even mentioned is quite concerning. I also think that even the issues that are mentioned, even what this agreement, I think, is trying to address, which is, I think, primarily ending the war, ending the conflict, and reopening the Strait of Hormuz. I think even the language on that and the kind of future on that is still concerning. Obviously, in the MOU, the strait is supposed to be open for the next 60 days, toll free. But on the Iranian side, I think for some time they've been signaling that there will not be a return to the status quo before the war. So there has been a lot of messaging that they will retain some sort of management along with Oman over the strait. So I think even on that issue, which this MOU is really, I think, centered on in many ways, even on that issue, I think things are very unclear, at least in the longer term. Again, however, with all that being said, positives, of course, are that regional actors are heavily involved in this process. Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia as well, Egypt, Turkey. I mean, so there, I think that some of the mediators might say that there is quite a lot of regional involvement in this process, and that will continue, and that is something that is positive. But I think, like everyone, there's just a huge list of concerns about how this will actually move ahead. On the nuclear side as well, I mean, it's common knowledge now that the previous Iran nuclear deal took years, right? So even, I mean, on that issue especially, I think nothing will really be settled in 60 days. So that will take a long time. So yeah, I would say cautious optimism.
Yeah, quite true. Have you gotten any sense from your recent visits in the Gulf as to how the Gulf states collectively, I mean, is it a collective sort of view of this, or has the UAE Saudi Arabia disagreement changed the dynamics of any sort of cooperation in the Gulf?
Right. So, I mean, this is obviously a really critical point to raise. I think previously there were very different views on exactly how to end this war. I think in recent weeks there's a bit more alignment than there was, and I think even, I mean, so essentially I think all of them were on the same page that this war should come to an end in some kind of way. And I think that even the UAE, I think, began to assess that, I think, once realizing that the White House really wanted this war to also end, and that they were not in a place to really escalate that much more against Iran. So I think once the UAE and others sort of read the situation, and especially the sort of mood in the White House on this war. And I think also just, as the attacks continued into May, especially against UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, I think there was also a sense that they just wanted these attacks to end. And then figure things out. So I do think overall there is more agreement on the need for ending the war, de-escalation, I think finding some sort of way to continue dialogue with Iran. I mean, there have been various reports on the fact that the UAE is already engaging with Iran and its new leadership at I think some of the highest levels. And I think this just shows that there has been a bit of a shift from, I think, a more hawkish approach to a more pragmatic one recently. So,
Thank you, Anna. Ross, how might this agreement reshape Iran's relationships with its Gulf neighbors? Does the MOU create an opportunity for a more cooperative regional order, or are the fundamental sources of tension between Iran and the GCC likely to persist despite what appears to be a diplomatic breakthrough?
Well, like my other panelists, I want to thank the Gulf International Forum and you, Ambassador, for having me, and also my esteemed panelists, Anna and Mehran. I'm just picking up on what Anna just mentioned in terms of perceptions, threat perceptions of the Gulf Arab states, and how each one has its own calculus relative to the United States, to Israel, and also to Iran. There were a number of fissures, as Anna alluded to, before this war, particularly between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, on issues related to Yemen and Sudan and other issues. And during this war, we will see in the coming days, weeks, and months whether those fissures widen or whether there is a closing of ranks to deal with some common issues in terms of reconstruction and getting beyond this war. That having been said, I think that one of the things that I sensed when I was in the Gulf is clearly the Gulf Arab states, and this is where I think they came together. They were furious at the Iranians for being targets in a war that they didn't start and weren't necessarily playing a role in. They were furious at the Iranians, but remember, the Gulf Arab states, almost each one individually, understood that this was the most likely scenario if the Islamic Republic, if Iran was attacked, and if it faced an existential threat. All of the wargaming, all of the modeling that took place in Washington and also in the Gulf suggested that if Iran is attacked and there is an existential threat to the regime, that there's two things they would do. They would strike out at the soft targets near Iran, which would be the Gulf Arab states that hosted American forces and American bases, and that they would likely close the Strait of Hormuz. So I think there was a tension between sort of understanding the strategic logic that Iran was following and being furious at them at the same time. But they predicted it. So there was sort of a general understanding of the logic. I think the other thing that I would say, which is maybe a bit more nuanced, and we have to see how it plays out, Ambassador, is question of threat perceptions. Certainly prior to this war and prior to the war last year, the June war, just a year ago, and then following the attacks on Doha by the Israelis to try to reach Hamas leaders last September, I started to see a shift in threat perception, because Iran over the last number of decades has been seen as a regional spoiler, a spoiler of regional architecture, basically projecting power into the soft underbelly of the region, into Syria, Yemen, so forth, and Iraq. And that the U.S. And the Gulf Arab states were stabilizers in some way, could be ultimately stabilizers. I saw a shift in that, that particularly during this war, as furious as they were at the Iranians, I saw also the States and Israel as potentially a destabilizing factor here. In terms of Iran GCC relations going forward is going to be a question. Whether that will actually spur some kind of a regional demand for a regional architecture, I think is very, very important to focus on, something to watch for going forward. I think the other thing is that this $300 billion sort of nebulous fund or agreement, part of this agreement, the question is, what does it entail? And how do the Gulf Arab states see that? Well, we haven't seen much reaction. At least I haven't seen much reaction over the last day or so. But I think the question about investing in Iran and looking at Iran as a possible opportunity for investment among the GCC states, but also the United States and other countries around the globe, I think could be an opportunity. And it could be, and I've seen signs of this, people thinking in this direction, could be an opportunity for some kind of a regional framework, economic framework, and maybe even a security framework that follows this war. So I'll stop there, but those are my sort of initial thoughts.
Yeah. When you were speaking, I was reminded of a conversation I had with someone fairly senior in the Gulf 2 years ago, after the Abraham Accords were being implemented rather well in the UAE, and an Emirati friend who is not entirely happy about this said, "Why aren't my leaders worried that we're going to get dragged into a war with Iran by the Israelis instead of the Israelis protecting us?" Does that sentiment still linger?
I think it does. I mean, I think, one of the opportunities, and I know in this business, it is safer to be a pessimist and to focus on the negative. I think one of the interesting twists of this war is whether Iran, that now is approaching the international stage with a bit more confidence. I mean, Iran had, particularly coming out of the Iran-Iraq War, Iran was sort of in a position of being strategically alone. And the potential for sort of Iran, possibly a more confident Iran, to strike a different posture in the region, a more confident posture, but not necessarily negative. It could be negative, but perhaps a positive posture particularly towards the GCC states, is an opportunity. So yes, I think there's a bit of air cover provided by the fact that this was the Israelis and the Americans that dragged the Gulf Arab states into war, and that Iran's attacks were a reaction to that, as opposed to a direct, immediate, or a somehow latent hostility between Iran and the GCC states. So I think that sentiment does prevail. Thank you.
Thank you. Returning to Mehran, how might Iran's evolving leadership shape the future of the agreement? With a new supreme leader and a changing generation of decision makers, how are debates over the MOU, its implementation, the upcoming 60-day negotiations likely to unfold within Tehran? Do we have a feeling as to who is actually calling the shots there?
Yeah, there's a couple of points that I think are important to keep in mind. First and foremost, we have a statement from the Supreme Leader that is really a page out of his dad's playbook, whereby he's giving himself plausible deniability, saying, I'm skeptical, but I'm going along with the recommendation of the president and the Supreme National Security Council. And Ali Khamenei used to do this all the time, saying, I'm skeptical, but I'm going to go along because, again, they have been stung a number of times. So that's an interesting point or space to watch. The other thing is, I think outside of Iran and even in some quarters inside the country, we've been desperate to look for and to find signs of internal dissent and dissension. And, the people point to different things. But in actual practice, what we've seen is remarkable unity within the political establishment in Tehran. And we have seen amazing cohesiveness, the decisions that are made by the Supreme National Security Council. One can imagine that there are robust debates and bargains and discussions and no doubt disagreements that go on in that body, in that critically important body, but decisions that have been coming, once they've been coming, it's almost like democratic centralism. Then those decisions have been followed through. Ironically, it's on the American side, both within the United States, within the Republican side, and between the US and Israel, where there's far greater dissent that we see than it is in Iran. Now, how does the new generation of Iranian political leaders view the unfolding developments and the MOU and kind of moving forward. We have yet to see. We don't really know. Our assumptions are that that generation of original revolutionary leaders, of whom Ali Khamenei was the last one, is all gone. We have now the second generation of the Iranian revolutionaries who have taken over. The assumption is that these guys are far more cosmopolitan, far more aware of Iran's place in the world, but also very dedicated to the ideals of the revolution. They are a product not necessarily of the Iran-Iraq war, but of anti-Israeli campaigns and anti-Daesh campaigns in places like Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. And so one would assume that they're a lot more diehard principalists. But we have already seen this um, um, this kind of ironic development in the Iranian political system, whereby they're a lot more savvy in getting their message across, but at the same time they're much more resolute in the principles that they want to abide by. And we've seen that in relation, for example, to Lebanon. We saw it in relation to Iran's attacks on not just the states of the Persian Gulf, but more specifically on Bahrain, and the way that that relationship is unfolding. And so I think the new leadership seems in some ways more pragmatic, but also much more resolute and much more determined to stick to its guns.
You reminded me a little bit of Winston Churchill's first book, Roving Commission, in which he describes, he said, how the whistle of bullets coming by focused the attention. And had, the bullets have stopped coming by, the bombs are no longer dropping on Tehran. They no longer have Tomahawk missiles and Israeli missiles hitting Iran. Obviously they stuck together through the fighting. And is 60 days enough for what should be the normal sort of infighting between the leadership or the aspiring new leadership, particularly with the demise of the old, sudden unexpected demise of the old leadership having happened so soon and so recently?
That's a really good question. The Iranians have been notorious in kind of prolonging negotiations. And this was particularly the hallmark of the Ahmadinejad era. And people who have that kind of a mentality to negotiate for the sake of negotiating rather than to negotiate for the sake of reaching an end goal. Now, I think what we have is what we had at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, which was a very pragmatic leadership that was very devoted to the ideals and principles of the revolution, but at the same time keenly aware of the need to deliver economically. And this leadership, if they do not deliver on economic reconstruction, on post-war reconstruction, if they do not get their economic house in order, all of their house will be in trouble. And so, they can bicker and squabble ad nauseum and talk to the Americans, but I think there's also a keen awareness that they have to deliver. And and that public backlash would be much stronger this time if they don't deliver on the post-war reconstruction, just as they did at the end of the Iran-Iraq war.
And that comment should remind us that we never should underestimate how clever Trump can be when it comes to money. Anna, how is the MOU being received in Europe? Do the European governments see opportunities for Europe to play a role in the region? And what role can they play? Can they play a role in supporting the implementation of the agreement, verification, or can they keep the 60-day negotiating period going all that time and perhaps extend the 60-day period? Anna?
I mean, I would say too, I mean, from what I can tell in terms of the reactions this week, they have also been, I think, quite positive from Europe, from NATO. Again, in the sense of everyone, I think, is relieved that this war is, at least for now, coming to an end, hopefully. I think, though, with Europe, of course, the issue there is always about sort of coalescing around one set of actions and policies, and that's always quite challenging. But I do think overall it was positive. I think on issues like sanctions relief, there were some of their senior officials in Brussels did indicate that they would, I think, fall in line on that front on some sanctions, not all, naturally, because there are multiple types. But in other words, I think that they would do what they could to support the implementation of this agreement, as long as it is going in the right direction and actually being implemented. Obviously, also too, I mean, several countries do play an important, but of course, supportive role. I mean, Switzerland was obviously supposed to host these sort of initial technical talks, which have already been postponed. But then also, of course, I think countries like France, countries like the UK have also expressed some initiative in terms of the Strait of Hormuz, demining, which are critical. But the question is, of course, I mean, these initiatives are all out there and I think have been discussed, but it's really unclear what role they will have in practice. I also just want to, if I may, kind of, follow on this conversation about sort of the economic component of this MOU. The Saudi foreign minister, I think it was Wednesday, was asked about this and said that he had no real knowledge about it and about the kind of whole concept behind it. Obviously, it's not a new concept, right? This idea of building up dialogue and trust between the GCC countries and Iran, and then eventually increasing economic cooperation. I mean, this has been part of the discussion for years. And as my panelists have both highlighted, I mean, this will be critical for Iran right now and moving ahead. But I do think it's important to highlight that it is still very unclear what role Gulf Arab countries will play on the economic front, right? Obviously, the UAE has in the past been Iran's major economic partner in the region, but will that continue? I mean, this is a major question. I think just there's been such a huge loss of trust. And while I think that longer term, I think Gulf Arab countries are absolutely, or some of them are open to the concept of increasing economic cooperation with Iran. But I think that is way in the future, for that to happen in a real kind of systematic way. I think we could, of course, see things in the short term from some, but I think the Saudi sort of view on this right now is that that is a long way off. So Thanks. Yeah.
I should have tossed in another question. There are some other non-European governments that are also that are very interested in this. Good examples being India and China. Do you think they can play a role in moving these agreements forward, given the importance of
Mhm.
keeping the Strait of Hormuz open for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they have supported the process, but again, I think that their role has been quite limited as well. I mean, China is obviously one of the most, if not the most, sort of critical economic partner for Iran right now. It's hard to imagine that implementing this MOU and continuing these talks would not include a fair amount of coordination with countries like China, especially. But I mean, I really don't get the sense that they are heavily involved right now. I think this MOU is still very much between the U.S. and Iran. I mean, even if it mentions, them and their allies in the region. I mean, no one else signed this except the mediator, Pakistan, right? So I think that there's a real concern about getting the support from other relevant regional and global actors. I think there's a huge concern about spoilers. And I think the other major issue is, again, Lebanon and incorporating that and basically getting the Israelis to really faithfully support this diplomatic process, which up until now they have not really. So I think that is a key concern, but I really do think that China has not played as big of a role as it could have, and I think that moving ahead, they should. Whether they will or not, I think is something else, because on the one hand, having the U.S. sort of bogged down in conflict in the Middle East keeps their eyes on that and away from China and Southeast Asia. But I think that China's role would be extremely helpful, and I think that that there is a fair amount of trust there between them, and I think that that's needed. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ross. Keeping in mind that the Gulf countries have one big disadvantage, which is geography. Unlike the rest of the world, closing the Straits of Hormuz for them was an existential threat. For everyone else, it was just a catastrophe. Will this agreement reshape Iran's relationship with its Gulf neighbors, coming from both sides? Does the MOU create an opportunity for more cooperative regional order? After all, the MOU is 90% an economic document, or are the fundamental sources of tension between Iran and the GCC likely to persist?
Well, I think, as you implied in your question, that, geography is tyranny, or the tyranny of geography here. I think that both the security needs of the Gulf Arab states and the economic needs of the Gulf Arab states. Remember, the Gulf Arab states have built their 2030 plans, Vision 2030 on the part of Saudi Arabia, and each state has sort of their own sort of 2030 vision going forward. Have been called into question by this war. So I think from a security standpoint and an economic standpoint, there will be the need to find a pathway back to Tehran. And I think Tehran was meeting with Iranians that in Doha. I got a general sense that they knew, Patrick, that they were burning through a lot of goodwill that had been established. Remember, Iran and Saudi Arabia had just reestablished diplomatic relations in 2023 after a breach that occurred in 2016. And so they understood that they were going to pay a price for launching missiles against its neighbors. But I think the calculus was that, number one, the Gulf Arab states at the end of the day understood the logic, as I mentioned earlier, the strategic logic. They wouldn't buy into it. They were furious at the Iranians, but they somehow understood the logic of this. and that there would be a way that there would be a pathway back at the end of this war, provided the war didn't destroy desalination plants and a lot of civilian infrastructure, that there would be a pathway back. So I think there is. And I think the other piece that I mentioned is the relative relationship between the GCC states and Tehran and GCC states and Washington and Jerusalem. Because I believe that going back to this issue of threat perceptions, which I think are very, very important during this war, but particularly as we climb out of this war, inshallah, hopefully, is the fact that the questions about whether, in fact, the United States, in particular, can be a guarantor, continue to be a guarantor of GCC security. There's no real alternative to the United States, but remember, the supply of security will be there from the United States, perhaps. But the question is about the demand, and the question is whether the GCC states will hedge their bets a bit. So I think that is, that is a question going forward. I think the other piece that is really important is the degree to which Iran, what Iran's pathway will be climbing out of this conflict. Mehran, I think, alluded to it, the fact that the Iranian government, the new crop of leadership, is going to have to face the facts that at the beginning of this war, before the war, there was a real challenge to regime legitimacy. We saw that in the protest, and we saw it even further eroded through government response to the protest, the brutal suppression of the protest. I think there's an understanding that in many ways, this conflict gave the regime, with new leadership, a potential, I'm hedging my bet here, potential on a new lease on life. And that lease on life would require focusing on, of course, the issues around the demands of the Iranian people, but also the economic lifeline to the Iranian people. That's something Mehran was created. So if, and say that this regime coming out of this war is even less principlist, maybe less ideological than they were coming out of the Iran-Iraq war, then I think the possibility of focusing on a new social contract between Iran and between the government and the Iranian people is there. Doesn't mean that's going to open up for free expression or opposition to the government, but focusing on the needs, the economic needs, and maybe even the cultural needs of the Iranian people are going to be there. And the reason I'm mentioning that now is that I think will militate for or against a better relationship with the Gulf Arab states. Because if in fact the regime becomes pragmatic and puts aside many of its sort of ideological revolutionary sort of ideas that may have contributed to getting them into this war, or getting them into the situation that led to this war, I think the potential for a desire for a security framework and some kind of economic relationship going forward is there. But that's an optimistic view, and I said in my business there's a bit of risk in that. But I think we need to look at both scenarios: the possibility that things will get worse between the GCC states and Iran, and things possibly could get better. And a lot of it, I think, does depend upon what happens inside the country of Iran, not just outside the country. Thank you.
Ross, one of the things my dad once taught me was if you're always a pessimist, you can be pleasantly surprised. The other way around doesn't work.
That's true.
Mehran, there have been a number of times that we've discussed sort of Iranian views, but one is, what do you think Iran is going to, how does Iran look at the GCC relationship?
Well, there's a couple of things, a couple of points that I just want to add to the discussion. First of all, I think we need to keep in mind that there's never been trust, despite diplomatic niceties, despite even cordial relations. There's never been deep trust between anyone, whether Iranians looking at the Gulf or the Gulf states looking at Iran. They just simply do not trust one another. The Iranians see the states of the GCC as American puppets, quite frankly, and the states of the GCC see Iran as innately revolutionary and as untrustworthy. I never forget during the Gulf crisis, there was this Singapore Security Forum where Iran was, at a time when Iran was the only lifeline to Qatar logistically in terms of logistics and supply chain. And high ranking Qatari minister gave a speech in which he said Iran is the biggest threat at the same time as the Saudis were digging a canal between Saudi Arabia and Qatar to turn the Qatar Peninsula into a Qatari island. And so there's never been trust between between either side, the way they see each other. And yeah, they've maintained diplomatic relations, but I don't think we should read too much into those diplomatic relations. The Iranian businesses here, for example, cannot get visas for extra chefs or extra. The Iranian foreign minister here in Qatar has repeatedly asked for air corridor to be reestablished. There's still no flights between Doha and Tehran. And so I think the substance of the relationship is what we need to look at rather than kind of diplomatic niceties and the statements that people make. That's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is, there's this Tehran University professor named Mohammad Marandi, and every time he gets on Al Jazeera, he would say before the war, he would say if there's a war between Iran and the United States, the entire region would be set ablaze. And everyone dismissed him, including myself, thinking the Iranians would never do that. And then the Iranian ministers would come through local capitals and would deliver stark warnings saying that if the Americans attack, we're going to attack their bases. And everyone dismissed that as hyperbole. So now we've seen realpolitik at work. We know that none of these guys trust one another. We know that they see each other as, we know that the UAE, that the Emiratis and the Saudis actually attacked Iran during the latest war. The Iranians are keenly aware of it. That's why they send more missiles to the UAE than to Israel. And I think there's kind of, but at the same time, there's this awareness that nobody's going away. The Iranians are not going away. The Saudis, Emiratis, Bahrainis, Qataris, Kuwaitis, they're not going away. And so they need to come to some sort of modus vivendi. And what is important is this win-win scenario. This is something I keep hearing again and again coming out of Tehran. And sometimes I hear it coming out of Doha, but I do not hear it coming out of Abu Dhabi yet or other places, certainly not out of Washington. And I think if we change the narrative, if the political leaders and policymakers change their narrative and their mindset to think about potential and possible win-win scenarios, then I think we're looking at a new security architecture in the region. If I may just add one last point, I know I've talked too much, but anti-Iran and anti-Shia sensibilities are once again reaching a fever pitch across the region. Just recently, just yesterday, we read in the New York Times that 67 Bahrainis had their nationality taken away from them and they were forced to purchase tickets to Tehran. And now they're in limbo. Some are in European capitals, some are in Azerbaijan and elsewhere. And sectarianism, which had begun to die down after reaching a high point following the Arab Spring, is once again rising with mass deportations of Shia Pakistanis in the UAE, mass citizen revocation in Kuwait, mass citizen revocation in Bahrain, and kind of if people start giving anti-Shia sermons on Friday prayers like they used to following the Arab Spring, then there's an awful lot of repair that needs to be done. And that is therefore critical for policymakers to lower the temperature, to kind of make sure we know none of these guys are democratic. They control the press. They need to tell the press and the Friday prayer leaders to kind of lower the temperature and have cooler heads prevail, so that sectarian narratives do not rise up again.
Mehran, I deeply regret to say that I agree with you completely. Uh, but you also raised another point. I've been going to the Gulf since retirement on, frequently 4 or 5 times a year sometimes. And from about 2008 or 2008, 2009, I began to hear from Gulf diplomats, from connected people, that an Iranian had just been through delivering this message that we're going to hit you, as that's our asymmetric response to an American attack. We don't need an atom bomb. We can just take out the western side of the Gulf. And I used to repeat this to friends in state and so forth. What shocked me was not a single American diplomat that I spoke to who was active, not a single American journalist that I spoke to, one had heard of this. And when I told them about it, they didn't believe me and they didn't think it would happen. I mean, where does this blindness in the American side come from? And that's a real question I like to ask. Anybody?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Mehran.
Sorry, if I may just jump in. Patrick, I used to give a talk going around the region saying there are 48,000 American soldiers and Tehran sees them as 48,000 targets. And people used to look at me like I'm crazy, like I am being needlessly alarmist. And we saw that the Iranians acted on that. And so I think one question moving forward is these American bases in the region that have been meant to protect the regional states against this sort of scenario, they've actually attracted Iranian attacks.
Yeah. I think the other piece of it here is that there has been sort of been blinders on, in many cases, American diplomats and American thought leaders in the United States concerning Iran and the possible contingencies about what would happen if Iran were attacked. But I think what we're facing now is even more dire, in the sense that there has been an erosion of expertise within the US government, in this administration in particular. The NSC is not really functioning properly. The State Department, many of the voices, many of the folks that understood Iran are either marginalized, sidelined. So I think in many ways, I think we saw it during the war, the fact that there was that it was the uptake in terms of the reality that was happening on the ground. The uptake in Washington was very, very slow. They consistently thought that somehow Iran would capitulate and so forth. So I think whatever problem pre-existed the war, I think is going to become amplified, perhaps, hopefully not in the negotiations that are to follow this agreement. But I think there is an asymmetry about the region and Iran in particular in the US government. So this notion of not expecting what had occurred, I think hopefully there have been some lessons learned and there's some expertise there, but I really question that.
I also just think that it's hard to not view this as the White House sort of kicking the can down the road. We have midterm elections. It's no secret that the White House is tired of this war. As you all have all said, there is just such a dearth of expertise right now that I think could really actually work towards a final settlement. So it's really difficult to be optimistic. But I also, the other big takeaway for me is that we could have reached this MOU without 3 months of war. I mean, if there's one thing that I'm really hoping that the White House has learned from all of this is that there is not a military solution to any of this. It will not help. It makes everything worse. And I don't know, but I hope that that lesson has been learned, that diplomacy is really the only way out of this. I mean, I feel like that's becoming clearer, but I think it's hard to know. And then my other sort of question that I'm spending a lot of time on is, again, I mean, as everyone has mentioned, what will this sort of modus operandi look like between GCC countries and Iran moving ahead? Obviously, we have heard that their sort of containment strategy with Iran, obviously hasn't worked, but I don't know if that's entirely true. One, I mean, I obviously understand why many in the Gulf are making that argument. But I think it was working until the US and Israel launched an attack on Iran, and this is what happens. But I also just think the GCC countries just have a lack of options, especially now that the sort of, wild card of a US and Israeli war on Iran has been used. It has happened. And Iran is still there. The leadership is there. So I think that over time, I mean, even with all of these, like the incredible amount of trauma and mistrust and tensions at a social, political, regional level, I think that just the Gulf Arab countries just don't have a lot of options. And I think at the end, longer term, I mean, dialogue is really the only way to move this ahead. But as Mehran rightly said, what that looks like in terms of substance, what the relations actually look like is what is, I think, is hard to know right now.
I don't even know how to answer that question either, frankly. I have a confession to make. When we were at full screen on one speaker, I was fiddling through my phone looking for news to see if my worst nightmare is going to come true or not. I mean, how bad is the situation in Tehran, elsewhere, with what is going on in Lebanon? Are we in any real danger that Netanyahu can succeed at blowing this thing up? I'll take any.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to address that if I may. I mean, I think that's the real question in any kind of a new agreement or understanding, particularly one as ambiguous as this, a memorandum of understanding, that there be spoilers, right? The spoilers can come, I think, as Mehran or someone mentioned earlier, there seems to be more coherence on the Iran side than there is on the American side with its allies and so forth. But there could be spoilers on either side, and I do worry about Israel and Lebanon. I understood also. I was looking at a screen also, and I think I saw that there was a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, which means that probably Tehran was sitting to some degree maybe on Hezbollah, and Washington was sitting on Jerusalem. Now, whether that continues or not, but I think the other thing, and then just I'll stop. That picking up on what Anna said, I think one of the questions is whether the sort of rickety security structure that existed in the region before, of deterrence and maybe some containment, that's sort of been washed away. And the question becomes what replaces it. And I think there's opportunities perhaps for some kind of a security framework. I alluded to that earlier. If you look at Europe after World War II, you never would have predicted that we would have an EU, within 45 or 50 years. And in Vietnam, at the end of the Vietnam War, you never would have imagined Vietnam becoming a member of ASEAN, the regional framework. So I think we should be thinking also not just about the bilateral piece of diplomacy versus the GCC states, but coming together, is there something to replace the old rickety structure that crashed down, some kind of a security framework that all states can buy into, and pick up on Mehran's comment, not based on trust, based upon some sense of an interest, self-interest, that this kind of war cannot happen again, and that can drive states that are distrustful of one another into some kind of an under agreement, perhaps reluctantly, but some kind of an agreement.
We're about to continue my record of going over time, but I'm going to ask one quick question, and really short answers from each of you in the same order. I saw the MOU as primarily a long economic bait, a long economic offer to Iran to come to terms on opening the strait and some reasonable nuclear deal. Starting at the top, do you think this will work a year from now? Mehran?
Yes, I do. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Anna?
Yes, I do as well. I think it will work. I think it has to. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm cautiously optimistic. I think one of the questions will be, particularly on the nuclear issue, is what the nuclear file means for Iran as it starts to develop its new national security framework. And I think that includes all of the pieces of its repertoire, its relation with Hezbollah, its nuclear issues, its missile issues. And I think there will be a reprioritization that will occur as they develop, like they did at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. They had a security doctrine that emerged out of that war. This war will create a new security doctrine. And that gives me a bit of hope, because I think Iran is more confident, has found new sources of leverage. And I think many of the issues that divided the United States from Iran, some of it were based upon insecurity on the part of the Islamic Republic. And I think perhaps, and again, this is the optimist in me, that a more confident Islamic Republic will be in some ways flexible. The hedge there is that in Iran, there's a perception that any flexibility is construed by the United States as weakness. So I think they'll have to thread that needle going forward. But I'm going to be cautiously optimistic.
You were the only one who didn't do a deep intake of breath before beginning to answer my question. Thank you all very much. I think this is about as informative and effective an exchange and piece of discourse as I've heard over the last week. And let's hope your optimism is well founded. Thank you all very much. Thank you to our audience, and see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.